entitled to pat down the outer clothing of a detainee anytime that officer has reason to believe that the detainee poses some kind of a danger to the officer's safety. The purpose of this rule, articulated in Terry versus Ohio, is to allow officers to take reasonable steps to protect themselves in a potentially dangerous situation while they're conducting their investigation. So our issue today is what kind of information do we need or observations do we need to make that would justify the pat-down of the suspect's clothing? We're going to go through a list of cases and a list of circumstances where it's been allowed and why. First, obviously, you can pat down a suspect if you see that they've got a weapon, and that was the case of Michigan versus Long. You can pat down a suspect if you see or if they're in the presence of weapons paraphernalia, like a knife sheath or bullets or a gun magazine, something like that. That was the case of People versus Lafitte. In the Terry versus Ohio case, you saw that the court said that you can pat down a suspect if you see a bulge that could be a weapon. You can also pat down a suspect if the crime that you're investigating, the crime that you've detained them for, is a crime that involves the use of weapons or a crime of violence. And that was a case of People versus Sunanen. Best I can do. Also, if the crime involves drug trafficking, because drug traffickers, dealers, people like that are known to carry guns, patting down a suspect in a drug trafficking case as opposed to a simple possession case would also be justified, and that's People versus Thurman. If you've received information, whether the information is reliable or even if it's unreliable, say, for example, somebody comes up to you on the street you've never met before and says, hey, that guy over there's got a gun. If you have information from a third party that somebody's armed and dangerous, that would justify a pat-down, and that's the case of Adams versus Williams. Also, a pat-down would be justified if you have a combination of certain circumstances or factors that could be potentially dangerous. Factors such as it's a high location, it's a high crime area, it's a deserted area, a deserted country road that makes the officer particularly susceptible to danger. Also, factors such as the number of persons present. If the ratio is 2 individuals versus one who are being detained versus 1 officer, or 3 to 1, that's a dangerous situation. Another factor would be if the detainee is a person who's on parole. Another factor may be the detainee's size or appearance. If the individual is clearly overwhelming in size and the size and appearance alone would pose a threat or a danger to the officer, that may be a factor. Sound may be a factor. Say, for example, you're approaching a car and the guy ducks down and you hear the sound of metal contacting metal. That could be him hiding a gun. That may be a factor in combination with other factors that would justify a pat-down for a weapon. Also, the detainee's behavior. The detainee is particularly argumentative, has some kind of an angry demeanor. Are they growling at you? Are they clenching their fists? Are they putting up their dukes like they want to fight? Are they refusing to follow orders? That kind of behavior, in combination with other factors, may justify a pat-down. Now, when we come to those dangerous circumstances or dangerous factors, in most cases, you're probably going to need a combination of 2 or more of those factors that will justify a pat-down, again, always depending on the situation and the circumstances of the individual case. So, for example, we had the case of People versus Williams, where the officer pats down a parolee that he's detained in a high crime area where he's walking with 3 of his other buddies. Now, the court held that, you can't just pat down a parolee on that factor alone, his parole status. But when you combine that with the other factors, like it's a high crime area and the ratio is 4 of them versus 1 officer, that combination of factors would justify a pat-down, would pose a dangerous situation to the officer, and he can pat him down to protect his own safety. Now, one of the things you have to be careful of is you want to do the pat-down as soon as you have reasonable suspicion to believe that they pose a danger to you. If you wait and do it later, it may look like your pat-down is actually a pretext search. That's what happened in the case of People versus Dickey. Officer stops Dickey out on a deserted country road where he's seated in a car with a passenger, has both of them step out of the car, asks Dickey for license and registration. Dickey says he doesn't have any. Now, the officer at that point asks permission to search the car. Dickey says no. The officer then conducts a pat-down of Dickey, feels a bulge, which turns out to be a packet of cocaine. Now, the officer tries to justify the pat-down in court on the grounds that, hey, there's two of them versus just one of me, and they didn't have license and registration, and we're out there on that deserted country road. But the court said, wait a second. You knew all that up front. You didn't pat him down up front. You only patted him down after they refused your permission to search the car. That made it look like the pat-down was really a pretext to do a search. The court basically said, look, if the officer was so worried for his own safety when he saw the two of them out there on that deserted country road, they didn't have license and registration and identification, if he was so worried, he would have patted him down right then. He wouldn't have waited to ask permission to search the car and waited to see whether they'd refuse. He would have patted him down as soon as he had concern for his own safety. So you want to keep that in mind. You want to make sure that you do your pat-down as soon as you've got the circumstances that are apparent to you that say, hey, I want to make sure that this person isn't armed. I'm going to pat him down now before I take this investigation any further. So that's a review of the things that will justify a pat-down under Terry versus Ohio, and that's it for today. I'll see you again with another update.